For 5 years, Dolly Parton said almost nothing about the man the whole world swore she was secretly in love with. She sang for him at his farewell concert. She posted one graceful tribute the day he died. Then, silence. No tell-all interview, no late-night confession, nothing. But everything changed after March of 2025, when Dolly lost someone even closer than Kenny Rogers, her husband of nearly 60 years, a man most of America never even saw a photograph of. Only after burying Carl Dean did Dolly finally say out loud what she'd kept locked away about Kenny for half a decade. The real nature of a friendship so intense that even Kenny's own wife once admitted she wasn't entirely sure nothing ever happened. What Dolly said next surprised everyone who thought they already knew this story. To understand why that silence mattered so much, you have to go back to where Dolly Parton's whole story began. Locust Ridge, Tennessee, January the 19th, 1946. She was the fourth of 12 children born to a tobacco farmer and a stay-at-home mother. Dolly has said it plainly. There wasn't a single luxury in that house, only love, and there was plenty of that to go around. As one of the older children, she was handed responsibility early. Her mother would simply tell her, "This one's your baby," and Dolly would be up in the middle of the night, feeding and rocking an infant that wasn't hers to raise. When she was only 9 years old, her baby brother Larry, the one she'd been given to care for, died as a newborn. Dolly has spoken about the heartache that loss left behind, grief handed to a child who was still a child herself. One of Dolly's most famous stories from those years involves a coat. Her mother sewed her a jacket out of scraps of leftover fabric, rags really, stitched together with whatever colors were on hand, and Dolly loved it more than anything she owned, because her mother had made it with her own 2 hands, out of love. The other kids at school saw it differently. They mocked her for wearing something so obviously poor, so obviously patched together. Dolly wore it anyway. Years later, she turned that exact memory into Coat of Many Colors, one of the most beloved songs of her entire career, transforming a childhood humiliation into one of country music's most tender anthems about a mother's love outweighing anyone else's judgment. Music became her escape and her calling, almost from the moment she could talk. Her mother sang the old Appalachian ballads to her constantly, and by the time Dolly was old enough to hold a guitar, she was performing on local radio and television. At just 13 years old, she made her debut on the stage of the Grand Ole Opry, introduced by Johnny Cash himself, and the audience loved her so much they demanded 3 encores from the skinny farmer's daughter from East Tennessee. After high school, she moved straight to Nashville to chase the dream for real, and nearly starved doing it. She's joked more than once about surviving on soup made from stolen ketchup and mustard packets during those lean early years, the kind of dark humor that would become her trademark for the rest of her life. There's an irony almost nobody mentions when they tell Dolly's story. Her own high school yearbook reportedly voted her least likely to succeed, a title that looks almost absurd once you know she'd already sung with Johnny Cash on the Opry stage before she'd even graduated. It's the kind of detail that only makes sense in hindsight, a reminder that the people closest to a story rarely see it coming. Her big break came in 1967, replacing singer Norma Jean on the Porter Wagoner Show. The first night did not go well. The audience booed, wanting Norma Jean back, and it took real convincing from Porter to win the crowd over to this odd, high-voiced newcomer. But once they clicked, the songs poured out of Dolly faster than she could find paper to write them on. Legend has it she scribbled "Coat of Many Colors" on the back of Porter's dry cleaning ticket on a tour bus somewhere between towns. Eventually, though, she outgrew him, and rather than simply walk away, she wrote him a song to say goodbye in person, sat him down in his office, and played him "I Will Always Love You" for the first time. Porter didn't take the split well. He sued her for $3 million over the broken partnership, and they settled for $1 million, a debt that took Dolly years to pay off. But time healed it. She was one of the last people at his bedside before he died, and she said she told him, in those final days, how grateful she was that they'd found their way back to friendship. That same restless, protective loyalty defined nearly every close relationship in Dolly's life, including the one with Carl Dean, the man she married and kept almost entirely out of the public eye for 6 decades. She met him her very first day in Nashville, 1964, at the wishy-washy laundromat, when he was 22 and driving by in his truck. He called out that she'd get sunburned standing there, and by her own account, what struck her most wasn't a pickup line. It was that he actually looked at her face while they talked, something she said almost nobody bothered to do. They married 2 years later, on Memorial Day, 1966, and Carl made a decision early on that shaped their entire marriage. He would stay almost completely out of the spotlight, skipping award shows, avoiding photographs, letting Dolly's fame exist in one world while their real life stayed in another. For years, rumors swirled that Carl Dean didn't even exist, that Dolly had invented him. She used to joke she wished he'd pose for one magazine cover, so people could at least know I'm not married to a wart or something. He inspired some of her most famous songs without most fans ever realizing it. Jolene, written about a real red-haired bank teller who'd taken a little too much interest in Carl early in their marriage, and From Here to the Moon and Back, a love song built entirely around him. It was against that backdrop of a quiet, guarded marriage that Dolly's friendship with Kenny Rogers became one of the most talked-about relationships in country music history. Kenny himself came from Houston, Texas, and had lived an entire musical life before he and Dolly ever crossed paths. A jazz bassist, a psychedelic rock frontman, and finally, a country crossover star with hits like Lucille, Lady, and The Gambler, a song so iconic it later spawned a whole series of television movies with Kenny in the starring role. By the time he met Dolly, he'd already been married 3 times, and he would go on to marry a 5th time, to Wanda Miller in 1997, a marriage that lasted the rest of his life. Over 6 decades, Kenny sold more than 100 million records worldwide and was eventually inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2013. The two met in the late 1970s, and by 1983 had recorded Islands in the Stream, a song Kenny reportedly didn't even like at first, until he heard how their voices locked together. It became the #1 duet of all time, according to CMT, and the chemistry between them on stage was undeniable enough that speculation about a real romance followed them for decades. By then, Dolly's own career had already exploded well beyond country music. 25 of her songs had reached #1 on the Billboard country charts. She'd go on to win 9 Grammy Awards, 3 American Music Awards, 7 Academy of Country Music Awards, and 2 Oscar nominations, making her one of only a handful of performers in history to be nominated by all 4 major American entertainment award bodies: the Emmys, the Grammys, the Oscars, and the Tonys. Her film debut in 9 to 5, alongside Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin, earned her an Oscar nomination and 2 more Grammys for the title song. And she went on to star in beloved films like Steel Magnolias, alongside Julia Roberts and Sally Field. None of it slowed her down from writing. By her own estimate, she has written thousands of songs across her lifetime, far more than she'll ever have time to record. And she's said openly that there's enough music sitting in her archive to keep releasing new Dolly Parton songs long after she's gone. Marianne Gordon, Kenny's 4th wife and the mother of his son Christopher, addressed it head-on in an interview shortly after Kenny's death. She admitted there was real tension between the 2 performers. Sexual tension and teasing, she called it. And while she said she never felt threatened by it, she also admitted she couldn't fully rule out that something might have happened on Dolly's side, given how Dolly herself has said she thinks, like a man, about relationships. It's the kind of quote most people expect a spouse to deny outright. Marianne didn't deny it. She simply said she chose to trust her marriage anyway. Dolly and Kenny themselves addressed the rumors directly in a joint interview with ABC News back in 2013. "It never crossed our minds," Dolly said, "because he was with people. I've been married. I've been with my husband 48 years. Kenny, in his own half-joking way, offered an explanation that somehow made the rumors more believable rather than less. I think that chemistry and that connection comes from an unrequited love, if you will, because we never consummated anything. Whatever the true nature of that bond, both of them, separately and together, kept landing on the same word for it: soulmates." Dolly told CMT in 2017 that Kenny's friendship meant more to her than any of their hit records, describing their connection as almost spiritual. Him from Texas, her from Tennessee, singing the same old country song to each other for decades. T for Texas, T for Tennessee. That October in 2017, with Kenny already battling the bladder cancer that would eventually take his life, Dolly walked out onto the stage of his farewell concert in Nashville and sang him the one song that meant more than any other in her catalog: "I Will Always Love You," the very song she'd written for Porter Wagoner 44 years earlier, now repurposed as a goodbye to a different kind of soulmate entirely. Witnesses in the arena that night said you could feel the room go still. It wasn't a performance. It was a farewell, delivered 2.5 years before Kenny actually passed. When Kenny Rogers died on March 20th, 2020, at 81 years old, Dolly's public response was graceful, brief, and carefully composed. The kind of statement written by someone determined not to fall apart in front of the entire world. "You never know how much you love somebody until they're gone," she wrote. "I've had so many wonderful years and wonderful times with my friend Kenny. But above all the music and the success, I loved him as a wonderful man and a true friend." And then for 5 years, that was largely it. No extended interviews unpacking the friendship, no further comment on the rumors Marianne Gordon had raised. Dolly Parton, a woman who has talked openly about nearly everything else in her life, her plastic surgery, her insecurities, even a period of severe depression, went quiet on the one relationship people wanted to understand the most. Then on March 3rd, 2025, Carl Dean died in Nashville at 82 years old after nearly 60 years of marriage that had somehow stayed almost entirely private. Dolly's statement this time was even shorter than the one she'd given for Kenny. "Carl and I spent many wonderful years together," she wrote. Words can't do justice to the love we shared for over 60 years. He was laid to rest in a private ceremony, exactly as he'd have wanted it, with the family asking the public for privacy during a grief Dolly had spent decades protecting from cameras. Days later, she released a new song, "If You Hadn't Been There," written specifically for him. "I wouldn't be here if you hadn't been there," she sang, "holding my hand, showing you care. You made me dream more than I dared." She called him in an Instagram post announcing the song the star of her entire life story. It was only in the months that followed Carl's death, grieving one loss, while still carrying an older, unresolved one, that Dolly finally began speaking more openly about what both men had actually meant to her, and for the first time drawing a real distinction between the two kinds of love she'd lived inside for 60 years. Carl, she has explained, was the marriage nobody saw, steady, private, uncomplicated, the man who kept her grounded every single time she came home from the road. Kenny was something else entirely, a connection built entirely in public, on stages and in duets, and in decades of teasing chemistry that both of them always insisted until their final years never crossed into anything physical. Losing Carl seemed to finally give Dolly the emotional permission to look back at Kenny's death honestly, not as a scandal to manage, but as the loss of a second soulmate, one she loved in a completely different register than the husband she'd spent her whole adult life protecting from the spotlight. What's remarkable, listening to Dolly talk about both losses now, is how little self-pity comes through. This is a woman who has been through more heartbreak than most people could survive intact. The death of an infant brother when she was only 9, the brutal $3 million lawsuit from the man who once helped make her famous, and, by her own admission, a period following a devastating affair of the heart with actor Burt Reynolds, so dark she once sat down intending to write a final letter to the people she loved before her dog Popeye ran up to her at exactly the right moment and pulled her back from the edge. She's called that dog her spiritual messenger. And yet none of it, not one piece of it, has curdled into bitterness. She still tells the same jokes. "I look totally artificial," she said once, "but I like to think that I'm totally real." She still says it costs a lot of money to look this cheap. Even grieving two of the most important men in her life within 5 years of each other, the humor never fully disappeared. It just got quieter. That resilience shows up everywhere in what Dolly built while she was living through all of it. Dollywood, the theme park she opened in 1986 near the Smoky Mountains that shaped her childhood, now welcomes over 3 million visitors a year and employs around 4,000 people, many of them from the same kind of poverty Dolly grew up in. It's home to the country's largest sanctuary for bald eagles that can't be released into the wild, and it was the first theme park in the world to build a dedicated calming room for children with autism, a detail almost nobody expects from a roller coaster park, and one that says more about who Dolly actually is than any headline ever could. Her Imagination Library. Founded in 1995 in honor of her father, who never learned to read or write, now mails free books to children across multiple countries every single month at no cost to the families who sign up. She built it to honor a man who couldn't read. It now teaches millions of kids who can. This isn't the story of a woman broken by grief. It's the story of a woman who has now buried two of the great loves of her life, and instead of disappearing from the world, chose to finally talk about both of them honestly, on her own terms, in her own time. Dolly Parton was voted least likely to succeed in her own high school yearbook. She succeeded anyway, in music, in business, in marriage, in friendship, and now finally in grief itself, breaking a 5-year silence, not because anyone forced her to, but because she was finally ready. What makes the timing so striking is that Dolly didn't need Kenny's death to teach her how to grieve in public. She'd already shown the world she could do that gracefully back in 2020. What she needed was Carl's death to teach her how to grieve honestly. For 60 years, Carl Dean got to be the one relationship in Dolly's life that stayed completely hers, untouched by cameras, unexplained to interviewers, protected from a public that wanted to know everything about everyone. Kenny, by contrast, played out almost entirely in front of an audience. Every duet, every wink, every just sit there and take it moment happening under stage lights with millions watching. Losing the private love and the public one within 5 years of each other may be exactly what finally gave Dolly the freedom to talk about them both in the same breath, without worrying which story people would twist into a scandal. So here's what we want to know. After everything you've just heard, do you believe Dolly and Kenny's bond really was something more than friendship, the way Marianne Gordon seemed to hint? Or do you think two people really can share a love that intense and keep it completely platonic for 40 years? And after losing both Carl and Kenny, do you think Dolly Parton has finally shown us the most honest version of herself yet? Tell us what you think in the comments below. Share this with someone who still believes in soulmates, and subscribe for more true stories behind the icons who raised us.